but I want to start off by acknowledging that I am a person who carries bias. I come to all of my relationships, all of my interactions, whether they're personal or professional, with some amount of ideas and feelings that I might not even realize that I carry with me. And I don't say that today because I want anyone to think that I'm a bad person. Actually, quite the opposite. I would like everyone here to think that I'm a very normal person who's just like the rest of us because of the bias that I carry. And so my goal over the next few minutes is hopefully to convince you all that accepting this very normal condition of being biased is a first step to addressing some of the widespread issues that have come up today when we talk about how to best support our students who are immigrants and who are people of color. So that having been said, what exactly is implicit bias? To put it simply, bias are the ideas and feelings that are so ingrained we don't even realize that we have them. And bias often comes into conflict with our conscious thoughts of ideas. Most of us are here today because we believe in supporting our immigrant students, we believe in building diverse schools, but sometimes because of our upbringing and because of the messages that we've been sent by society, by our own education, by our political atmosphere, we aren't always the best equipped to support, to really create those, or to really create a more supportive environment. So as I've said, bias is actually a very normal occurrence for everyone. That's a part of simply how humans think. And I'd like to turn a little bit to the research of Dr. Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics for his work on behavioral economics. And I'd just like to point out that Dr. Kahneman is an immigrant to the US, and he holds dual citizenship with the US and Israel. And most of the Nobel Prize winners who are American are in the same boat, that they're immigrants, just as a fun fact. So what Dr. Kahneman found in his research is that the human brain processes about 11 million pieces of information a second. And that's just way too much for somebody to sit and process every single stimuli, every single thing that's happening in our environment. And so what humans do is that we've developed what Dr. Kahneman refers to as a slow and a fast way of thinking in order to process different situations and different pieces of information. So your slow thinking is more or less your conscious thought. If you're thinking about doing a math problem or planning an event, you're going to be using your slow thinking system. But we can't do that for every single piece of information. And so we also have a fast thinking system that enables us to do all kinds of things. It enables us to, for example, type on a keyboard without having to search out every single key, or remember somebody's name, even if we haven't thought about that person in a really long time. And so the brain develops all of these shortcuts for thinking by recognizing patterns in our environment and building connections between different ideas and different categories of people. And we're all very good at creating these connections and associations. And just to demonstrate that, I'd like everyone to just finish this phrase, as American as blank. Is it the Mississippi River, apple pie, a game of basketball, or Hollywood? And I'm not surprised to see that 90% of you picked the answer as American as apple pie. And I might be about to break some hearts right now, but actually, apple pie isn't originally from America. Apples are indigenous to Central Asia, and the apple pie recipe that we have in the US is most closely resembles a recipe that first originated in medieval England, although a lot of other European countries, France, Germany, Scandinavian countries had similar recipes. And so it was immigrants from those countries that brought apple pie to the US, And it's only been in about the past 100 or 150 years that it's been recognized as this universally beloved cultural symbol of America. And so I want to point out just a few things about that. One is that the association of apple pie in America is so prevalent that it's become almost a universal truth for us. And that also, when we talk about the phrase "as American as apple pie," I think most of us feel pretty positive and happy about it. It evokes an idea of home, celebration, eating delicious dessert, probably with your family or friends. And so that warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you hear "as American as apple pie" is a positive bias. It's a feeling that's associated with a particular phrase that you just get when you hear it. It's just so deeply ingrained. But the last thing that I want to point out is that the phrase "as American as apple pie" also doesn't actually cover the full history of apple pie and tell us about its origins. And so that's a pretty fun and silly example when we're talking about which type of dessert is the most American. But it can become a big problem when we try and create other categories that are the most American, particularly what kind of people are the most American. And so what I'm going to bring up here is an identity wheel, and this talks about different identity groups. And when people try and use that fast system of thinking to create associations about different kinds of people, we tend to break people down by different identity groups. This wheel shows age, physical ability, ethnicity, gender, race, and sexual orientation as major identity categories. However, I'm going to point out that this particular model doesn't include immigration status, and that is absolutely an identity category on which people are judged. So what human beings often tend to do is to create categories of people and associate different broad ideas and different feelings with them. Some of you in the homework have done the implicit bias test from Project Implicit at Harvard. If you haven't done it, you want to do it, we'll drop the link in the chat box. But what this test can show you is how quickly you form a positive or negative association with one of these different groups of people. And if you're anything like me, you probably were a little bit surprised if you got the results of your test and found out that you may actually have a more difficult time creating a positive or negative association with groups that you didn't expect. And so again, like I say, we all have a little bit of bias. Please check out the test if you want to see ways that you may or may not be biased. And I highly recommend checking that out. Second, and so I want to talk about why this is important in schools, because we tend to have the most overgeneralized ideas about people whose identities and backgrounds are very different from us. And again, that's normal if we don't have a lot of context for who those people are. But when we see this in the context of schools and school demographics, it can show you why there's a real problem. And so this chart shows us the demographics of, by race and ethnicity, of public school students and teachers over the course of 30 years, excuse me, from the middle of the 1980s to about 2015, 2016. And what we can see is that, while teacher demographics have stayed relatively similar, and the majority of teaching staff in schools are white Americans, the demographics of students is changing. And so there are a lot more, especially Hispanic and Asian students in classrooms right now. And this is a trend that's increasing. Researchers suggest that the diversity of schools is going to continue to change. However, teachers are still majority white and majority native born. Again, we can take a look at the amount of immigrants in education professions. by different levels who are immigrants and native born, and compare that to the amount of students in classrooms who are immigrants versus native born. And actually, I wanna point out here that while a relatively small percentage of students in schools are immigrants themselves, a lot are first-generation immigrants or have at least one parent who's foreign born. And that's important because as we talk about the demographics of teachers matching the demographics of students, we also have to talk about the demographics of teachers and how that mirrors the demographics of parents and the communities that students are coming from. Because again, we don't just want to talk about the way implicit bias can affect students, we also want to talk about the ways that it can affect students' families and their communities as well. So let's talk about this in slightly more specific ways for how this can impact students. And if you're in the chat box right now, I'd actually love to see if you have any examples of the ways that biased actions or biased attitudes have affected you and your students. I know that we've heard we've heard quite a few. We're going to keep hearing more, but please feel free to share those. So one impact on students that bias in teachers has is the concept of adultification, where students who are immigrants or people of color are often treated as adults as opposed to children. And that means that they may be disciplined as adults. They may be given more responsibility or expected to take on more responsibility, and also that they may be considered sexual in a different way that white children are in terms of dress code violations or their responsibility in their personal relationships. And some people might stop and say, well, different students do become adults at different points. There's not a hard and fast place where that line exists. But I do want to say, as teachers, we have the responsibility to make sure that all of our students have that place to be children, and that we're not putting more responsibility or placing our bias on certain students because they may have more to deal with in their other lives, or they may have already gone through experiences that have forced them to grow up faster. No, those students should actually be given a very safe space in schools to act like children. The next impact this has is allocation of attention and resources. Some teachers have noticed that, or have perceived that Latino and Black students are not as good at math or not as naturally capable at math, and that anyone who's not white is not going to succeed in an English class. Similarly, studies have shown that teachers perceive their Asian students to be better at math. But in both of those instances, whether a teacher perceives that a student is not going to grasp the material anyways, or they think that they're naturally good at it, that can lead a teacher to spend less time and energy helping that student with course material than they would on average, and that has quite an impact. Also, in the cases where teachers believe that students are not going to succeed no matter what they do, again, in the case of students of color and students who are English language learners, they may push those students towards taking remedial classes or vocational tracks. And that's a great disappointment because, as we know, students who are English language learners or may have another barrier to academic success actually can do just as well as other students do if they have extra time and resources to complete their coursework. I'm sure that this is something that a lot of you are familiar with, the term microaggressions. And this just refers to ways that people can say something that's biased or hurtful without really understanding that they're saying something that's biased or hurtful. So again, you can see examples such as, that I think have already come up a little bit, such as suggesting someone speaks good English. Well, that can tell somebody, that can communicate to someone that you don't expect them to speak English well. And that can make someone feel, a student feel just as much as an outsider, or feel as though no matter how well they do, they're going to be living up to a different set of expectations. And that can still be really harmful. And then one final example of the impact that this can have on students is tokenization, where a student who is, again, an immigrant, a student of color, or a student of another identity group that's not well represented, can be forced to stand for that entire identity to their classmates or to their community. And this has come up a lot recently as Americans have are talking about racial injustice and how to address it in our country. That people will reach out to their only friend who's a person of color and expect them to explain racism to them. So please don't do that. Please don't ask your students to stand up as a single example of their own culture, because you wouldn't ask the same thing of a student that comes from your own identity group. And I think from what I've seen in the chat box today, we've had a really vibrant conversation about how diverse our identities are, how diverse the words that we want to use to represent ourselves are. And so by asking one person to stand for all of a particular culture, you may be putting them in a box that they don't want to be in. Unfortunately, studies have also shown that just being aware of your own implicit bias is not nearly enough to overcome the problems that bias creates. And so please don't feel as though now that you've had this quick introduction to implicit bias, you know everything about it and you're ready to take it on. Addressing implicit bias is going to be a project that takes really your entire life to do. I know that our presenters from Teaching Tolerance are about to give a really great presentation about how we can address instances of biased language and individual actions in our school. But before we get there, I'm going to go very quickly through a few interventions that you can also take or also consider. One is blind grading. In instances where there's a large discrepancy in academic scores between minority students or students of color, immigrant students, and native-born or white students, one intervention that has been shown to work is to grade papers and grade tests without having identifying information about the student present, so that those expectations that teachers have for different students don't affect the way that they assign scores. Another conversation that we all need to have is how to build more diverse schools and build more diverse relationships with our communities around schools. And so that really does mean having attention to hiring practices. But again, for many of us here, hiring is not part of our day-to-day work in our jobs. And so we can do other things, for example, by inviting members of immigrant student communities into your classroom, inviting parents in, and not just, inviting them and saying that's it, but really doing the work to build a relationship. I actually heard a story just a few days ago from a friend of mine whose mother is Spanish and was invited to participate in a PTA bake sale, which, all of the other moms thought was a very nice thing to do. But when this Spanish woman showed up and said that she would love to contribute by making flan, which is a Spanish dessert, we're having a dessert theme today, the American mothers were, didn't take on to that idea and said, no, we have to make cookies, brownies, and cupcakes. And so it seems like a very small thing, but that simple act of not going the extra, putting in the extra effort to make sure that somebody's culture and their contributions are fully recognized and welcome can be a huge barrier to welcoming diverse communities into your classroom and into your school. Can talk all day about building inclusive narratives, but I'm going to actually direct you to check out some of the other webinars that we've done about the ILC, about inclusive narrative work at the ILC, and also to participate tomorrow because we're going to be having a session about immigrant student storytelling. So we're going to talk about this a lot more in depth and give you a lot more great resources. And finally, I want to end by saying that we need to practice self-care and community care. I started off by mentioning that I'm a person who carries bias. We all are people who carry bias. And unfortunately, the times where we rely most on those mental shortcuts and allow our biases to get the better of us are when we're tired, we're stressed out, or we're feeling emotional for other reasons. So whenever you see an instance of bias, whenever you see that in yourself, remind yourself it's not you being a bad person. It's not you failing. What makes the difference is giving yourself the space to learn and making that part of your day-to-day activity rather than making each instance a catastrophic moment. And so again, that was a very quick introduction, but we're going to be talking a lot more about this in depth with our next presenters.